So today we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations and ways to solve quadratic equations. So these are three different ways you can solve using completing the square. You won't get to that until next year. Factoring and quadratic formulas. We're going to talk about both of these today. But before we get into any of those, one thing you have to watch out for that's the easiest way that everybody misses is what if I just have just the quadratic term? So there's no linear term, in other words, there's no x term, just the square term. If that happens, there's two ways you can do that. One way is just to go ahead and factor this into 2x plus 3, 2x minus 3, and then we can set those both equal to 0. We'll talk about that zero product property here in a second. 2x minus 3, and then solve for 0. So solve for x. So you just subtract 3 from both sides. 2x equals negative 3, divide by 2. So x equals negative 3 halves. You can add 3, so notice that this time it's being a positive 3, divided by 2, so, sorry, x equals positive 3 halves. So x is going to equal what we show as positive or negative 3 halves. So this is kind of a sign for both positive and negative numbers there, okay? So there's another way you could do it. Also, instead of factoring, you can just add 25 to both sides. So you just isolate that x squared term, x squared equals 25, and then you just take the square root of both sides. And when you do that, you can say x equals, and when you take the square root of both sides, you have to consider the positive and negative solution, because 5 squared is 25, and negative 5 squared is also 25. So we have to make sure we get both the positive and negative solution anytime you take a square root. Okay? So anytime you have just the squared term, you don't have the x term, you can just isolate that term and take the square root. You can also just factor and go x plus 5, x minus 5 equals 0. Set them both equal to 0 and solve that way as well. Okay? So the next thing we'll look at is factoring. So the factoring, we use what's called a zero product property. It's kind of what we just did a second ago. For all real numbers a and b, if I have two factors, a times b equal to 0, I know that one of them has to be 0. Because if you multiply them together and they give you 0, then a has to be 0, or b has to be 0, or both. Okay? And so x plus 3 times x minus 2 equals 0. This factor or this factor has to be equal to 0, or both of them. So by that product rule, x plus 3 must be equal to 0, or x minus 2 equals to 0. So then x would have to be equal to negative 3 or positive 2. Okay? And that's the product. That's the rule we use when solving for quadratics. So here, what we do, because it's a zero product property, we want to get everything equal to 0. So we're going to subtract 42 from both sides here, and we're going to have x squared minus x minus 42 equals 0. Then we're going to use our factoring skills we just nailed the other day. We're going to say, what are factors of 42 that add up to a negative 1? In this case, it's going to be a negative 7 and a positive 6, right? Because negative 7 times 6 is negative 42. Negative 7 plus 6 gives me a positive 1. So this will factor into x minus 7 times x plus 6 equals 0. So since that's all equal to 0, either x minus 7 must be equal to 0, or x plus 6 must be equal to 0. So I split those two up and say, well, then x minus 7 must be equal to 0, or x plus 6 must be equal to 0. And from there, I can solve for x. I just add 7. I subtract 6, and then I know that x must be equal to 7, or x must be equal to negative 6, and those are my two solutions. Okay, and that's how you solve by factor. So maybe you want to try this by yourself. So you might want to pause the video and see how you do with this, okay? So the first thing you always do is you get everything equal to 0. That's like step number 1, always, unless you only have a squared term. But since this time we have this x term, we want to get everything equal to 0. So this is going to be x squared plus 13x plus 22 equals 0. Now I want to find out what our factors are. So factors of 22, multiply to give us 22, and add it to give us 13. That's easy. That's 11 and 2. Right? So there's just one combination. So x plus 11 times x plus 2 equals 0. And since both of those factors multiply together equals 0, we know that x plus 11 must be equal to 0, or x plus 2 must be equal to 0. So then we're just going to solve x must be equal to negative 11, or x must be equal to negative 2. So those are our two possible solutions. X equals negative 11 or x equals negative 2. Okay? So next thing we can use, so that's factoring. Next thing we can use is called the quadratic formula. So usually when I'm factoring like this, I only solve by factoring when I have no number in front of my x squared term. That's really nice. No number in front of my x squared term. When I have a number in front of my x squared term, if you recall from factoring, it takes a little bit more effort to factor, right? So a lot of times I'll just use quadratic formula to solve because it will take a while to factor, okay? So quadratic formula, we have this beautiful formula here, and you'll probably learn how that comes to be next year. But we have ax squared plus bx plus c. So the first thing is to identify what's my a, what's my b, what's my c, okay? And then we just plug it into this formula. And you might want to just memorize this, and there's lots of things you can do to memorize it, but you just want to get this kind of memorized. Plug in the numbers and then simplify it. Simplify carefully because we have this subtraction sign here, we have this positive negative here, we have a square term. So you always want to simplify very, very carefully when you're doing the quadratic formula because that's where people usually mess up, is in the arithmetic. Okay, so let's see what we have here. We have a equals 3. We have our b that equals negative 5. So don't forget those negatives. And it's not the x involved, just the numbers. Okay, and then my c equals negative 2. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and plug this in. X equals the opposite of b. The opposite of negative 5. Plus or minus the square root of b squared. So we have negative 5 squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. 2 times a. That's the easiest part of the memorization, is 2a. Okay? So we have that equals so the opposite of negative 5 is a positive 5, plus or minus the square root of, that's going to be 25. Negative, so this 4 is a negative, right? And another negative, that's going to be a positive number. So negative 4 times 3 is a negative 12, and then negative 12 times negative 2 is a positive 24. So it'll be plus 24. So be careful with your negatives right there. Over 6. That's going to equal 5. Plus or minus the square root of 1 over 6, which will be 5 plus or minus 1 over 6. So now we're going to take that up here, and we're going to write it as x equals 5 plus or minus 5 plus 1 over 6, or 5 minus 1 over 6. So that's a plus and minus right here. So there's plus and minus, so we have to split them up and have two solutions now. Okay? So it could be 6 over 6, or, whoops, that should be 5, sorry, or 4 over 6, right? So this should be 1 or 2/3. Just that. Those are my solutions. And that's how quadratic equation works. Very simple, just plug and play, okay? Let's try one more. You guys want to go ahead and try this and pause and see how you do. So this one, my a is equal to 5. I already have it in standard form. I want to check that. Oh, sorry, my a is not 5. Gracious. A is equal to 2. My b is equal to 5. And my c is equal to negative 3. Okay. So we have x equals the opposite of b. Oops, I should use that as black. Opposite of b. And we have plus and minus the square root of b squared, so just 5 squared. Let's square like that. Minus 4 times a times c, which is negative 3, all over 2a. 2 times a. Okay, I'll start evaluating that. So x equals negative 5 this time, plus or minus the square root of 25. And this is negative 8. Negative 8 times negative 3 is a positive 24. So plus 24 this time, all over 4. So x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 69. No, 49. 49. Yeah, right here. X equals -5 plus or minus 7. Square root of 49. 7 over 4. So x equals -5 plus 7 over 4, or -5 minus 7 over 4. So 2/4, or what is that, 12, -12/4. So x equals 1/2, or -3 in the other solutions. Okay, and that's how you use quadratic formula to solve. All right, so you guys have your worksheet in Google Classroom, and I will talk to you later. Make sure you bring some questions, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.